And that's why it matters, whether or not you do this. That's why it matters. People say, well, gee, if it's all an illusion, then why does it matter what I do? Well, the reason it matters is because if you don't do this, you will stay stuck in that illusion forever, in your experience. So the real question isn't whether or not this works. The real question is, how long do you want to prolong your suffering? And if you've decided that you want out, and you want to stop coming back here and reincarnating, and it doesn't mean that you don't get to live the rest of this life. As I've said, you don't have to give up anything in this world. It's just a different way of looking at it. And if you do this, then you will be doing something that very few people in human history have ever really done. You will be joining the ranks of people like Jesus and Buddha. If you practice this kind of forgiveness that forgives people not in the old-fashioned Newtonian sense of the way, but forgives them in the new quantum kind of a way. This kind of forgiveness is very much in harmony with the new quantum physics, which teaches that there's not really any such thing as separation. Everything is connected, everything is one. You can't really separate one thing out from anything else. So when you forgive another person, you're the one who is going to get the benefits of it. And if you go through life saying, you are Christ, pure and innocent, all is forgiven and released, then you will get in your unconscious mind that you are Christ, and that you are forgiven, and that you are released. Because no matter what you put out there, it's really going to you. It's being translated by your unconscious mind as a message to yourself, not to the other person. And that's why forgiveness is always a gift that you really give to yourself. And if you do it, your experience of yourself will eventually start to change. And this kind of forgiveness is very much in harmony with the teachings of A Course in Miracles, which teach that the world you see is an illusion of a world. God did not create it, for what He creates must be perfect as Himself. So, if anybody ever disputes with you the fact that A Course in Miracles teaches that God did not create the world, you can remind them that the Course specifically says that God did not create the world. For what He creates must be perfect as Himself. And that means that reality is perfect, and that what we're seeing with the body's eyes, through the eyes of perception, is not perfect, and so by definition, it is not real. And if it is not real, then we're forgiving people for what they haven't done, not because they've really done something. And that's quantum forgiveness. That's advanced forgiveness. That's the real deal. That's what undoes the ego the quickest. And if this miracle was substitute for learning that may have taken thousands of years, then just imagine what you're doing for yourself. Because when you practice this kind of forgiveness, the Holy Spirit takes it everywhere throughout the universe of time and space. A Course in Miracles teaches that our part is really very small, and that the Holy Spirit's part is very big. That idea is probably very annoying to the ego, but the truth is all that we're asked to do is practice forgiveness on the everyday things that come up in front of our face on any given day. Things aren't going good. We don't get the job that we want. We don't get the girl that we want. We don't get the guy that we want. Those are the kinds of everyday lessons that the Holy Spirit wants us to practice forgiveness on. The Holy Spirit doesn't make those things happen. We're the ones that made them happen. The Holy Spirit never brings a difficult lesson into your life. The Holy Spirit wants only peace for everyone and never suffering. I've heard people say things like, well, the Holy Spirit wanted me to get raped so that I could learn this lesson. That's not true. The Holy Spirit did not want that. The Holy Spirit did not want anything that is separate from God. What the Holy Spirit does want is for you to change your way of looking at it and to forgive it. And that may seem impossible at first in some situations. How can you forgive a guy like Osama bin Laden after the World Trade Center? How can you forgive a guy like Hitler? How can you forgive all these terrible murderers who have murdered people's relatives? How can they forgive somebody who's murdered their wife or husband? It would seem impossible at first. And yet there are countless stories of people who eventually were able to forgive those very kinds of things. And when they did so, they learned that the forgiveness wasn't really for the other person. It was really for them, because it changed their life. It changed the way that they felt about themselves and the way that they experienced everything. So once again, you're the one who is going to benefit from any forgiveness that you give to others. This kind of forgiveness will bring about experience in your life, spiritual experience. And it's experience that will really make you happy. It's not words, it's not theology, it's not intellectual concepts. Those are just words. It's like A Course in Miracles says, words are but symbols of symbols, twice removed from reality. Well, how is a symbol that is twice removed from reality ever going to make you happy? No, the only thing that will ever really make you happy is not a description of reality. What will really make you happy is an experience of reality. And that is the answer. And that's why this is really about experience and not religion. Every major religion starts with an experience. It starts with somebody like Jesus who is experiencing his perfect oneness with God. And he teaches by example so that people can get where he's coming from and how, there's nothing special about him. Jesus wasn't presenting himself as being God's only begotten Son. He was saying, look, if you follow my example, if you think like me, if you look at other people the way that I do, then you can be like me. He wasn't presenting himself as being different or special or any better than anybody else. He was simply leading by example. And if you follow that example and practice the same kind of forgiveness that Jesus did, then that's what leads to real experience. If you devolve it into a belief system and make a religion out of it, then what that does is it actually prevents people from having the very experience that the original was talking about. And that's why I said earlier that this is about going back to the roots. It's about going back to the real deal and what Jesus was really talking about, instead of what religion took it and made it into, which has absolutely nothing to do with what Jesus was really teaching. So you could say that Christianity was based on the theology of the Apostle Paul and the beliefs of others who came after him, instead of on the teachings of Jesus. It may also be helpful to remember that not only were the teachings of Jesus drastically changed by the church over a period of several hundred years, but that the most important early teachers of Jesus were either written out of Christianity completely, or the information about them was altered to make them look bad. Two perfect examples of that would be Mary Magdalene, who was one of the earliest and greatest teachers of Jesus' teachings and was an equal to him, and she was completely written out of history by the church. It's as though she doesn't even exist today in Christianity. And then later on, the church wanted to make her out to look like she was the prostitute that Jesus saved from being stoned to death, and that wasn't true either. That was simply made up later by a pope who declared in public that it was Mary Magdalene who was the prostitute. But the Bible doesn't even say that. So there you have these men writing the most important woman teacher completely out of Christianity and altering the entire picture. You could say the same thing about St. Thomas. A person was very clear that she was not what you would call a doubting Thomas. And she made that very clear in The Disappearance of the Universe. She was simply curious when Jesus came back. And so, as Thomas in that lifetime asked Jesus if he could touch him to see if he was really there. That's just curiosity. I don't think there's one person that wouldn't be interested in maybe touching Jesus to see if he was really there. And in fact, Persa actually allowed me to touch her one of the visits. It was the visit about forgiveness. And actually, that was my favorite visit because that's the one where Persa came alone. And she actually let me touch her, and I walked up to her and I just touched her on the arm. I touched her flesh, and it felt just as real as any body that I've ever felt in my life. It was just as real. And I think what Arden and Persa wanted to do was teach me not that their bodies were real, because the point was that no bodies are real. It wasn't strange that they were appearing before me, no more strange than the fact that we appear here. It's just that they did it all at once, and we go through this whole ritual of being born, and then going through, what appears to be several different lifetimes in one lifetime, as the body changes so much that it might as well be a different body at different points in our life. And what happens is that all bodies are projected by the unconscious mind. But almost all of them are projected based on the ego thought system of separation. So you could say it's the wrong part of the mind where that projection is coming from. Arden and Persa's bodies, on the other hand, were projected by the right part of the mind. And so what they are doing is teaching the Holy Spirit's word and teaching us a way to return home. By the way, when a body appears to be born into this world, even that is symbolic of the separation from God. Think about it. A baby is in its mother's belly, and it's perfectly provided for and totally taken care of. It has no problems. Everything is wonderful. Everything is like nirvana. And that, of course, is an imitation of heaven. And then what happens is the baby is thrust out into this cold, cruel world, almost like being slapped in the face by reality. And it comes into the world screaming in terror. and you have this terrible situation that the baby is thrust out into. That, of course, can only be symbolic of the separation from God. And everything that we see here, in some way, is symbolic of separation. When an airplane goes down, what is that symbolic of except the fall of man? When somebody gets shot or somebody gets stabbed or blown apart, what happens? The body separates. When somebody dies, what happens? We're separate from them. We can't see them anymore. We can't get them back. Well, that's the way that we felt about God when we had this first original instant of separation. We felt like we lost Him. In fact, the only experience in this world that can really come close to what it must have felt like at that massive metaphysical level in order to get in touch with what that would be like, the only thing in this world that would come close to it would be if somebody who you really love dies. And then you would know what it felt like at that original instant of separation. And that's why in one of the pamphlets that goes along with the Course in Miracles, Jesus says, "And who could weep but for his innocence?" You know, we think that we're weeping and crying over the loved one that we've lost, but what we're really crying over is that original separation from God, which is, once again, why A Course in Miracles says that I am never upset for the reason I think. What I'd like to do is read one paragraph here from A Course in Miracles, which kind of like describes how all these different ideas fit together. And it's about that original instant of separation from God. This is part of what Jesus says in A Course in Miracles about that original instant of separation. He says, "You do not realize the magnitude of that one error. It was so vast and so completely incredible that from it a world of total unreality had to emerge. What else could come of it? Its fragmented aspects are fearful enough as you begin to look at them. But nothing you have seen begins to show you the enormity of the original error, which seemed to cast you out of heaven, to shatter knowledge into meaningless bits of disunited perceptions, and to force you to make further substitutions." So, we can see from that reading from A Course in Miracles that there are major distinctions between what the Course is saying and what other spiritual paths are saying. For example, the whole idea that God doesn't really have anything to do with the universe of time and space. The great part about that is that it absolves God of any of the bad things that goes on in this world. People will ask, well, how could God allow such pain and suffering in the world? How could He allow the tsunamis and the hurricanes and all this suffering and terrible things that go on? And the truth is, God doesn't have anything to do with it. And that's an idea that takes some getting used to. For example, I've had people say to me, well, if this is true, it means that God doesn't even know that I'm here. Well, actually, that misses the point. The point is, you're not here, and God knows where you really are. And we have a natural tendency to want to drag God into the world and drag Jesus into the world, but they have a better idea. They want us to wake up so that we can be with them. And that's like the whole point. So you could say that what A Course in Miracles is focusing on is not the universe of time and space, because that's just the effect. That was made by the mind. And the magnitude of the mind is way beyond what we suspected. And so the universe is the effect, and what we want to do is quit fooling around with the effect and go back to the cause, which is where the real power is, in the mind. A Course in Miracles says at one point, and I think that this is a statement that most of us can relate to, the Course says, "The world you seem to live in is not home to you. And somewhere in your mind, you know that this is true." So the truth about what we really are and where we really are is buried there in the mind that projected the universe of time and space, and it can't ever be lost. You can never lose the truth. That's because the mind is holographic. So everything is still there. Everything that you ever learned, everything that you do learn in this lifetime, you don't have to worry about losing it. You can never lose anything that you learn. You take it with you, and it stays in the mind, which is holographic, even after the death of the so-called body. And the mind keeps right on going and keeps everything that you've learned. And in your next lifetime, if you have one, you could pick up a copy of A Course in Miracles and read it, and all of a sudden it would make sense to you, and you wouldn't know why. But then maybe you start to remember as you go along. I learned this in my previous lifetime. That's why it seems so familiar to me. And it may make sense to you, and there may be other people sitting around reading it and they're looking at it and they're saying, what's this? What does this mean? And you already know what it means because you've already studied it before in this lifetime, and you simply carry it with you to your next lifetime. So it can be fun and it can be pretty cool. And one thing that you'll want to remember, and this is important because there are almost no spiritual teachings in the world that are what you would call purely non-dualistic. And A Course in Miracles is a non-dualistic teaching. And what that means is that of two possible things, the world of God and the world of man, that only one of them is true. The world of God is true, and nothing else is real. Nothing else exists. That teaching is very rare, but it has happened before. There was a spiritual document in Hinduism called the Vedanta. And the Vedanta is a purely non-dualistic teaching that teaches that of the two seeming worlds, the world of God and the world of illusion, only the world of God is true and nothing else exists. And that is the same kind of a teaching that we find today in A Course in Miracles. In fact, Bill Thetford, who was the person that Helen Schuckman read the Course to and he typed it out, at one point Bill Thetford described A Course in Miracles as being like the Christian Vedanta. And he meant that this was another expression of the fact that only God is real and that nothing else exists. Almost every other spiritual teaching in the world, the major religions, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, all the major teachings, up to and including Conversations with God, which is one of the most recent, all of them have God creating a world that is separate from Him, that is not Him, and then interacting with it. And that makes God responsible for this world and for everything in it. That is not what A Course in Miracles is teaching. A Course in Miracles is teaching, no, God has absolutely nothing to do whatsoever with this world. And that's how we end up with a God who really is perfect love, instead of a God who is flawed and who interacts with the world and has a personality like a human being. That's not the real God. So the way of looking at the universe of time and space that we've been discussing has nothing to do with consciousness, except in the sense that we're being asked to make a choice between one of two things. We're being told that there are only two things, and that only one of them is real, just like we mentioned in that description of non-dualism. And what we're asked to do in forgiveness is make a choice of what we really are. Are we a body that seems to be stuck here in the effect of the universe of time and space, or can we go back to the mind, which is the cause, and choose instead to be spirit, which is what we really are? So it always comes down to a choice between one of two things, and in that sense it's very simple. We're always asked to choose what we are, and the fastest way to do that is to choose what other people are. So we see other people, whether it's in interactions with them on our everyday life and in our everyday life, or we see them on television, or we see events on television, and we see politicians and we start to react. And what we're asked to do instead is simply to forget about all that and realize that we're the ones who made it all up in the first place, and that we can choose better. And in that time, we can choose to be spirit by seeing them as being spirit, because that's the message that we're sending directly into our own unconscious mind. So it doesn't really have anything to do with raising consciousness. Consciousness, as we said earlier, is the domain of the ego, and that includes all consciousness, because consciousness involves the level of perception and seeing and subject and object. So this isn't about raising your consciousness, it's about educating your consciousness to choose correctly between spirit and separation. And that's really all it's about. It's not about evolution. Spirit does not have to evolve. Spirit is already perfect. It doesn't have to get better. What we have to do is undo the ego, and in so doing get back to our experience of what we really are, which is already perfect, but it's out of our awareness. And that's why the Course teaches that this is about removing the blocks to the awareness of love's presence, which is your natural inheritance. If we think we have to evolve, that's a trick of the ego. The truth is, the more things change, the more they stay the same. You always have good and you always have bad. Those are opposites. And once you have opposites, they continuously play themselves out in some way. So you may have the illusion of improvement. Maybe the quality of life gets better. Things seem to get better in some areas, but then they seem to get worse in other areas. And that's the trick of evolution. The ego is really just spinning its wheels. So you have one disease that gets cured, and then you have another disease that pops up that didn't exist before. Hundreds of years ago, a couple of thousand years ago, or even 1,000 years ago, it would be something like the plague, different forms of plague, or the Black Plague, and there were different kinds of them. That's what it was then. You cure that, in the 1950s it was polio, you cure that, and then a couple of decades later, everybody's worried about cancer, and then a new disease pops up like AIDS, and so you cure one and another one comes along. I've been hearing for decades about all this tremendous progress that they've been making in fighting the war on cancer. And, of course, more people are getting cancer than ever. The only difference is they're living longer. But what we want to do is deal with the cause of cancer, not just the treatment of it. And the cause of cancer is just like the cause of everything else. It's this unconscious guilt that's in the mind. It's that guilt that causes everything, including all of the compulsive behavior that people have, all of the addictions, all of the drives that people have. Some people may be addicted to drugs, some people alcohol, for some other people it might be sex. For some other people it might be shopping or gambling. It doesn't really matter what it is. All these drives and urges and compulsions that people have are this unconscious guilt in the mind that's driving them, and they're not aware of it and they can't see it. So what we want to do is not just deal with those things, but get away from them and back to the level of the mind where the cause is. And by doing so, we can change our mind and have this unconscious guilt healed by the Holy Spirit. And that is a real solution to the one real problem. And everything else gets taken care of and kind of follows naturally from that. But it's the cause that must be dealt with, not the effect. And the ironic thing about that is that if you go back to the cause and change your mind, then the effect follows anyway. So, in a way, what you're doing is you're giving up something that doesn't work, which is dealing with the effect, and going back to something that does work, which is dealing with the cause. And that's where the real power is, and that's how we can really have an impact on the world. So it's not so much about abandoning the world, it's about doing something that works instead of doing something that doesn't work. Everything that we see in the world is for forgiveness. That is the one true purpose of everything. And if you make that your purpose in life, you will make tremendous progress in your spiritual life. I would dare say that a spiritual teaching like A Course in Miracles has more in common with Buddhism than it does with Christianity. Yes, it has Christian terminology. You find a lot of terms in A Course in Miracles that sound like Christianity, but that's really where the similarity ends, because it's much more mindful, and it's a spiritual discipline that trains the mind in a certain way of looking at everything. It's about total non-judgment, and it's about this new kind of forgiveness that we've been talking about. And Buddhism has that same thing, that goal toward total non-judgment. The way A Course in Miracles puts it is the ego cannot survive without judgment. And that's one of the ways that Buddha undid his ego, was through total non-judgment. We're not really judging anything at all. And A Course in Miracles, I think, is a little bit more proactive in the sense that it's about actually choosing to look at people a different way. So it does have an extra dimension to it, and it does bring in this beautiful and lofty vision of God that doesn't exist anywhere else until the Course. But essentially, it always comes down to not judging and forgiving instead. And I just think that the Course is a little bit more proactive in that it gives us all these right-minded ideas and right ways of thinking about things and looking at things, especially in the workbook and in the Law of Forgiveness chapter in The Disappearance of the Universe.
This concludes Session 2 of The Secrets of the Immortal. Our program continues with Session 3.
this forgiveness can apply to everything in our life, whatever situation you find yourself in. I found that was the case when my first book, The Disappearance of the Universe, was published. What that did was eventually turn my life upside down, because I had been living almost as a recluse in Maine, and I wasn't meeting a lot of people. I did have one Course in Miracles group that I went to for actually about 11 years, from 1993, about 6 months after Arten and Persa introduced me to the Course. I started going to a Course group. I went to this town in Maine, it's called Leeds, Maine. It has no sidewalks, and there would be like 4 of us sitting there studying A Course in Miracles. I went for 11 years. After the book came out, more people started coming to the Course in Miracles group, so I eventually left because it wasn't the same. But that 11 years was very helpful to me in talking about the Course. Eventually, when it got to be the time where the book was going to be finished, this is like 2001, and remember, Arten and Persa appeared to me from 1992 to 2001 in December, and that was about 2 months after the 9/11 tragedy. And we talk in the book about how I dealt with that, and they coached me on how to deal with things like that in the future. But in September of 2001, I had a decision to make. There's this Course in Miracles conference that they had in Bethel, Maine. And every year I was going to go to this conference. And I was going to, meet some people. I didn't really want to. I felt shy. I felt uncomfortable about talking with people. And every year I was going to go. They had this thing every year. I was going to go in 1993, and then I decided not to go. I was going to go in 94. I didn't go. I was going to go again, 95, 96, 97, 98. I stayed home. 1999, 2000, I'm saying to myself, oh yeah, I got to go to this Course in Miracles conference. I'm going to meet some Course in Miracles people and get to know them. I stayed home. The idea of meeting people and talking to people just didn't make me comfortable, and I didn't know what to say, and I didn't know what to do. That's because I was withholding forgiveness from that particular aspect of my life. I figured, well, it's okay here, but I'm not going to do it here. And as long as we withhold it from different parts of our life, it's not universal, which is what it has to become in order for us to be completely healed. Now, in the fall of 2001, it was getting to the point where the book was going to be almost done. It's like Arten and Persa told me that they had one more visit with me in December, and so I knew that I was getting to the point here where the book was going to be finished within the next few months. And I thought, well, if I'm actually going to do this and I'm going to get this book published, then maybe, I should start talking to somebody. And I knew that they had this Course in Miracles conference in Bethel, which means House of God, by the way. I thought that was pretty cool. And so finally, in October of 2001, I went to this Course in Miracles conference after meaning to go to it for like 10 years. I finally went to it, which was a good thing because it turned out that was the last one that they ever had. And it was about a month after the 9/11 tragedy. And the crowd was down because people were very spooked about traveling at that time. And there wasn't a really big crowd, but there was a nice crowd there, and they were very, very nice, very friendly people. And I remember there was this Course in Miracles teacher named John Mundy who was there. And John is a very well-known teacher of A Course in Miracles because he's been teaching it longer than almost anybody. He was introduced to it back in 1975 by the scribe of the Course, Helen Schuckman. And so I looked up to John. I had heard of him, and I knew that he had books out, and he traveled all over the country, and he was one of the few people, and still is one of the few people, who does that, to just teach A Course in Miracles. So I wanted to meet John, and I was so shy. I remember he was selling his books out in the hallway, and I walked up to him, and I said something like, "Hi, John, my name's Gary. I got these 2 Ascended Masters. They're appearing to me in person. Pretty good, huh?" He just looked at me, and it's like, okay. And he didn't say too much more about that. But I did meet some people at the conference and got to talk to them, and I realized that they, hey, these are pretty nice people. These are really nice people. And I definitely had no idea at all that I would ever get up and speak in front of people. In fact, I actively had chosen not to do that. Then what happened next was the book was published about a year and a half after that. In March of 2003, it finally got to the point where it was published and was being read by people. But about a year after this Bethel conference, in the fall of 2002, the book was finally done and it was ready to be published, and I had found a publisher, Fearless Books, and I was pretty excited about that. So this time I wrote an email to John Mundy, and I told him even more about the book, and I gave him more details about the book. And he didn't answer me. And that made me feel kind of bad. And after a while, I was getting a little peeved. And then after a little bit more time went by, I realized, hey, wait a minute, that's a forgiveness lesson, just like everything else. So I forgave him the best that I could. And then I let go of that, because if you're really forgiving, then eventually you kind of let go of it and you don't think about it much anymore. And if you do think about it, it doesn't upset you or activate you the way that it did before. And then a few more months went by, and it was March of 2003, and people were starting to read the book, and I got a phone call. And it was John Mundy on the telephone. This guy who wouldn't answer my email, now he's calling me on the telephone. And he said, hey, Gary, I'm reading this book here that you wrote. This is really great. It's fantastic. You know what? I'm going to be coming to Portland, Maine next month in April, and I'm going to do a workshop there at the local Unity Church in Portland, Maine. I'd like for you to come, and I'm going to tell people about the book. John was really the first one to go around the country telling people about the book. And he was excited about it, and he was coming to Portland, and he said, why don't you come and I'll tell people about the book, and you don't have to say anything, I'll just introduce you to the audience, but you don't have to say anything. So that sounded pretty cool to me. I knew where the church was. I had been there once or twice, didn't really get into it because I don't like to get up early in the morning, and I would have had to drive 45 minutes to go to this church every Sunday morning if I wanted to go to church, and I wasn't into getting up that early and driving for 45 minutes to the church, so I'd only been there like once or twice. But I went that day, and John gets up, and first he speaks at the church service, which I thought was pretty interesting. I could never imagine myself getting up and doing that and speaking to a church service. I've done it many times now, but at that time, I couldn't ever picture myself doing that. And John got up, and he was so good and so professional and so smooth. He had been speaking in public about 42 years. At this point, he became a Methodist minister as soon as he was old enough, at the age of 18. And you talk about somebody who was born to be a minister. This guy, when he was a kid, when he was 10 years old, he used to play in his cellar, and he would have imaginary weddings and funerals in his cellar. That's how much he was meant to be a minister. And John spoke, and then what he did was he told people about the book, and he introduced me to the audience. And I got up, and I looked at the crowd, and I said, hi, and then I sat right back down again. And that was my first speaking engagement. And John took me out to dinner afterwards, and we went to this nice seafood restaurant in Portland, Maine. John did a workshop first that afternoon, and then we went out to dinner, and John was very good. When we got out to dinner, John starts talking to me, and he says, well, hey, Gary, this book of yours, this is really great. You're going to get out there and you're going to talk to people, right? You're going to speak. You're going to, give people your experience, right? And I said, no, John, I don't think so. I don't think that I could do what you do. There's no way that I could get up and speak in front of these people the way that you do. And he said, well, that's okay. You don't have to go out and speak if you don't want to. But let me tell you what's going to happen if you don't. Then he started to tell me about this writer, Carlos Castaneda. And Carlos had written this series of books called the Don Juan materials. I think the first and most famous one was called The Teachings of Don Juan. And the thing about Carlos was that he very seldom spoke in public. And even when he did, he wasn't that specific about things. And so to this very day, people aren't really sure if those books were all true, or maybe some of them was true and maybe some of it was made up, maybe some of it was embellished. Maybe it was all made up. I mean, people just don't really know for sure what Carlos' experience was because he didn't really tell them. And John said to me, he said, if you don't get out there and tell people your experience, then they'll never know. They'll never know if this really happened. They'll never know if that was your real experience because unless you're clear with people and tell them right to their face, then they tend to make up their own ideas and they tend to make up the way that things were in their mind. So maybe you should consider getting out there and at least telling people what your experience was. And that started to get me thinking a little differently about public speaking. And also, when I said hi to the crowd that day and didn't want to say anything else, it dawned on me once again, it was sinking in that all of this was about forgiveness, that it wasn't really about what it looked like. And I was reminded of that line from A Course in Miracles, I'm never upset for the reason I think. And I started to think, if I'm afraid of getting up and speaking in front of people, that's not what it's really about. It's really traceable back to this original idea of being separate from God. That's the reason that I'm really upset, and I've made up this substitute reason, and I think that I'm afraid of people when that's not really what I'm afraid of. And we're never upset for the reason we think. We're never afraid for the reason that we think. So I did start to think a little bit differently about speaking, but I didn't really think that I could do it. And that night in April, John said, I'll tell you what, Gary, why don't you come to New York City? Why don't you come to Manhattan and do a workshop? And I'll put on the workshop. You don't have to worry about the logistics of it or everything. I'll put it on. You can just come and do the workshop. I'll introduce you. And I couldn't believe it when I heard myself say yes. And the workshop was going to be about 7 months later in November in Manhattan. And as soon as I left the restaurant that night, I started trying to think of a way to get out of it, because I still didn't want to get up and speak in front of people. And nothing happened after that for months. I still didn't talk to anybody. I didn't get up and speak to people. And I was just trying to think of a way to get out of going to New York and doing this workshop. You know, like I'm going to go to Manhattan and I'm going to talk to all these people that knew the scribes of A Course in Miracles, Helen and Bill, and I'm going to tell them about A Course in Miracles, and I'm going to tell them about my experience with art in person. And I just couldn't picture myself doing that. And then what happened, it was about July of 2003, and I got a call from this woman on the telephone, and her name is Vicky Poppy. And Vicky's like the unofficial ambassador of A Course in Miracles to New England. I mean, she knows everybody. And she's a very popular, very vivacious woman. And she called me up and she said, oh, by the way, she's also a friend of John's. And she called me up and she said, hey, Gary, I'm coming up to Maine and I'm going to bring some people with me. We're going to have a prayer meeting. We're going to get on the ferry and go out to Peaks Island off the coast of Portland there. And we're going to have a prayer meeting. Why don't you come with us? Okay, it'll be fun. And that sounded pretty cool to me, because I like Maine in the summertime. I'm not a winter person, but I like Maine in the summertime. And I like the idea of getting on the ferry and going out to the island. And so I said yes. And I got there and we all went out to the island and we're all sitting around in a circle in the sun. And I felt nice and relaxed. The sun was warm and I had been letting the Holy Spirit in. And all of a sudden, we're doing this prayer circle and we're quiet. Then all of a sudden, Vicky says to me, hey, Gary, why don't you tell us about your experiences with art and in person? And I felt nice and relaxed that day, so I just kind of like told them my story of what it was like to be visited in person by art and in person. I told them, you know, these are my true experiences. This is just the way that it happened. I'm not a writer. I never intended to be one. I'm not even interested in writing. This is just the way that it happened, and I just recorded it the way that it was. And that's my life from 1992 to 2001. This is the way that it was for me. And I told them my experience. And it was fine. And then afterwards, we're heading back to the ferry, and Vicky comes up to me, and she says, hey, Gary, you just told your story to 10 people. If you can tell your story to 10 people, you can tell your story to 100 people. And what's the difference? It's all an illusion. So she kind of had me there. And then she said, Gary, I'll tell you what. I'll put on a workshop for you at my house. Right? You can come to my house. We'll just have, a workshop for you at my house and just see if you like it. And if you don't like it, you don't ever have to do it again. She even said, I'll call John and I'll tell him that you don't want to come to New York in November. But you've got to try it at least once. You've got to see if it's something for you. You'll never know if you never try. So I figured, well, what the hell? This woman wants me to come to her house. And how many people are going to show up at her house? So I said yes. And at the beginning of September in 2003, I was going down to Vicky's house. Vicky has a home in Quincy, Massachusetts, which is across the street from the home of the former President of the United States, John Quincy Adams. It's on Adams Street in Quincy. In fact, I got to go to the John on Adams Street in Quincy. And Vicky had this workshop for me. And by then, more and more people were reading the book, The Disappearance of the Universe. And I was surprised by how many people showed up. And there were a lot of them, and I did the workshop, and I was nervous, but I noticed about 20 minutes into the workshop, when I did this thing that we shared, where we join with God, and where we actually do that prayer with God, I felt that I was different after that. When I joined with my source, I felt different than I did before. And I realized that was interesting. How much less nervous I was and how much more connected I felt. And I felt like something was being expressed through me after I joined with God, and I figured, well, maybe I could do that before I go out, and then I'd be less nervous right from the beginning, and more connected, and have this information flow through me more smoothly. So that was encouraging. But what really changed my mind, what really turned me around about the whole thing, was the people who were there. That is what really surprised me, because these people were so loving and so supportive, and they were so good to me and so encouraging that I thought, how can I lose? This is what it's going to be like. If this is what the people are going to be like, who I'm speaking to, then how can I miss? I mean, these Course in Miracles type people, these spiritual type people. I mean, even if I suck, you're supposed to forgive me. So I realized that I was going into an environment where people would be supporting me. And between that and the idea of joining with my source and joining with God, I started to think that maybe it was possible for me to actually do this, to get up and give talks and give workshops to people. And I tried it one or two more times to small groups before I went to New York City. And by the time I got to New York City and went into Manhattan and did this workshop with John, and there were a lot of people there, that's when I thought I'd be the most nervous, and I was actually the least nervous by then. And something was definitely shifting, because I realized now that I could use it for forgiveness, that whenever I got nervous, I could use it as a lesson that the Holy Spirit wants me to learn. And we can do that with everything in our life. It doesn't matter what it is. For me, it may be having a book, it may be getting up and speaking in front of people, it may be talking to 5 million people on a radio show, or whatever it is. Whatever it is for you, it's no different. Your forgiveness lessons are every bit as important as mine, every bit the same as mine. Maybe you have a nervous situation at work. Maybe you have something new for you that you've never done before and it's making you feel a little bit uncomfortable. Maybe it's a relationship, but whatever it is, those are the lessons that the Holy Spirit wants us to take and to learn and to practice forgiveness on. And if we do, then we're using A Course in Miracles for what it was meant for. It was meant for forgiveness. It was not meant for understanding. At one point, my teacher Arden was talking about metaphysics, and he said, understanding metaphysics, that plus $1 will buy you a cup of coffee. Nowadays, he'd probably say that plus $4 will buy you a cup of coffee, but it doesn't really matter, because the point is, it's not what we know, it's what we do with what we know. And if we practice the Course, then we're using it for what it was meant for, because as the Course says, forgiveness is the means of the atonement. And we can't get to the end without utilizing the means. I know A Course in Miracles students who've been studying the Course for 20, 25 years who are still sitting there arguing about what some paragraph means. There's no happiness to be found there. At one point my teacher said, the world has its head up its butt looking for the light. There isn't any light up there. As long as you're dealing with the level of form, as long as you're dealing with effects, then there's no happiness there. What you've got to do is you've got to go back to the level of the mind and change your mind with this kind of forgiveness that we've been talking about. Then you'll be using A Course in Miracles for what it was meant for. It's all about the way that we look at other people and situations, and that will determine everything about what you are and how you feel about yourself. And we've seen many examples of that. Take somebody like Mother Teresa. Mother Teresa went through life, and she saw everybody as being perfectly worthy of God's love. And it didn't matter what their religion was, and it didn't matter ultimately what her religion was. Religion is something that exists on the level of form, on the level of effect. So that's not what's important. What's important is the way that you look at other people. And Mother Teresa wasn't even ministering to people from her own religion most of the time. Most of the people who she helped were Hindus. But she looked at them all the same. She didn't leave anybody out. She looked at everybody with perfect love. She looked at everybody as being totally worthy of God's love, totally worthy of being with God. She saw them as they really were, which is innocent. And she saw them with this kind of love, and in so doing, that is how she came to experience herself. When she saw them with perfect love and didn't leave anybody out, when she forgave everything, then she was completely forgiven. And she experienced herself as being perfect love, the same as God, looking at everybody with God's eyes, which is seeing them as being pure. And in so doing, That is how she became what she really is, which is spirit. And that has to work. Those are the laws of the mind. It's all about how you see other people. And I would contend to you that a person who the world may judge as being mentally challenged, somebody with an IQ of 70 or something, if that person is going through the world seeing everybody with love and seeing everybody with forgiveness, I would say that that person is making more spiritual progress in this life than the intellectual who goes through life using A Course in Miracles to make himself right intellectually and make other people wrong. Because that's not love and that's not forgiveness. So it's not always the way that it looks. It's all about the way that you're looking at other people and thinking about other people. And if you want to use the Course to make yourself right, you can be my guest, but it's not going to get you anywhere. What it's really about is forgiveness. And it doesn't matter if you agree with me about what A Course in Miracles means or not. What matters is that you take the Course and your understanding of it, whatever it is, and use it to forgive the world. And if you take whatever your understanding is and then do something with it, which is to apply it and use it for forgiveness, then you'll be using the Course for what it was meant for, which is forgiveness. And then you will make tremendous spiritual progress regardless of whether or not we have a couple of disagreements about what the Course means.